So listen, it's my absolute pleasure to be here. It's a little bit daunting, I'd have to say. I realized when I walked into the building, I'd obviously dressed not quite the right way. I'm just going to blame Silicon Valley on that. And what I wanted to do for the next half an hour, having stolen someone's watch because I'm trying to give them up, is talk to you a little bit about where I think the future is going. I know this is an event dedicated to talking about disruption. I realize that disruption can get talked about in a lot of different ways. It can be a scary thing, it can be a thing that needs to be managed, it can be a thing that you sometimes hope you're just going to get to the other side of intact. I want to suggest it's also a different set of opportunities and some ways that we might want to think about how we husband and shepherd our resources and where we might want to place our bets. I framed this talk around the notion of AI because I know that's a conversation we're all having. I want to be really clear here about a couple of things though. One is that AI as a label, the notion of artificial intelligence, there are as many definitions as there are technologists in that field and also cultural anthropologists. The thing about AI is that really it is in fact a constellation of technologies that run from data through machine learning and sensing and algorithms to include, I would actually argue, both ethics and the data that fuels that whole cycle. And artificial intelligent technologies are with us now and functioning, but they are the beginning of a much longer transformation that we need to be paying attention to. So every time I say AI, imagine that is shorthand for something much more complicated. And I want to think here about what is all that technology going to mean for human beings, our systems, our institutions, our organizations, and our countries. So there's lots of ways to locate all of those remarks and to think about them. You heard my formal biography. Here are the other things you need to know about me. Not only am I a cultural anthropologist by training, I did my PhD at Stanford in the late 1990s. My work was in Native American studies and feminist theory. You can imagine how someone like me would end up in a tech company. It was an obvious training right there. And the reality is, like many Australians in the late 1990s knocking around the rest of the world, I met a man in a bar in Palo Alto in 1998, and he changed my life by offering me a job, which was excellent. And I've spent the last 18 years at Intel prosecuting a particular agenda about how you put people into the business by which we make technology. The notion being that most innovation has up until now been driven by the notion of what was technically possible, not always about what people wanted, what they cared about, what they were passionate about, what frustrated them. And my job at Intel was to bring all of those things together. But I come to anthropology through a sort of sideways route. I'm actually the child of an anthropologist, true. I grew up on my mum's field sites in Indonesia and in Central and Northern Australia in the 1970s and 1980s. I spent most of my childhood living on Aboriginal settlements in a time when those settlements were still new, and I was lucky enough to spend that childhood speaking Warlpiri, not wearing shoes, killing things, and I hasten to add eating them, just in case you were concerned there. And it was the most remarkable childhood you can imagine. And it left me with a very particular way of thinking both about the world and my role in it. My mum was really clear that one of the things you should do coming out of a childhood in Central Australia and looking at how Australia contended with its original people was that we all had an obligation to make the world different than the world we found it in. So I'm in some ways part of, I think, sometimes the last generation in Australia who was raised on an idea of service, that you should remake the world into a place that you actually want to inhabit with all of your energy and all of your capacities. So that's taken me all over the world. It recently brought me home to Australia. The Vice-Chancellor at the Australian National University told me it was time to come home. And he told it to me in no uncertain terms, and then he offered me a really interesting job, which was to think about how might we manage these emerging systems. So how would you frame all of that, right? You know, what's an anthropologist doing talking about technology? Why do I care about these things? Why should you care about them? Well, partly you should care about them because of this chart. The World Economic Forum published this graph about 2 years ago. In it, they attempted to, in some ways, stabilize the last 250 years and give it a clear cadence and a clear kind of structure. And what they said was we have had 4 waves of industrialization. The first one we all know about, that's the original one. It involved a steam engine. It was basically when stuff got mechanized. We know this as, the dark satanic mills, lots of, big machines, transformations in production. And, that happens between the late 1700s and the middle of the 1800s. The second wave of the Industrial Revolution here is pegged to the production really of electricity and mass market production. Think of this as the factory line. So this is really the late 1880s into the 1920s and 30s. The third wave of industrialization comes with computers. So think of this as basically World War II onward. And then what the World Economic Forum said 2 years ago was, we are now entering the beginning of that fourth wave. And that fourth wave will be, according to them, characterized by cyber-physical systems. Now, there are a couple of things you can say about this chart. It makes all that look really tidy. Like, that looks really clean and simple and straightforward. And the reality was, if you were anywhere in the world as that was happening, it was not that tidy and clean and straightforward. There were massive social upheavals, there were dramatic transformations in terms of political systems, in terms of what got made by whom and how it was circulated, consumed, or rejected. We created entire new academic disciplines to contend with these things, new forms of public policy, new forms of regulation. Frankly, most of you know wars were fought on the basis of who had access to these technologies, and those technologies changed the ways wars looked and felt. It's been a complicated thing. It's also the case that each one of those new revolutions didn't wipe out the previous one. Computers needed electricity. Production lines needed machinery. Each one of these waves has been cumulative. This fourth one, however, is interesting because, like each one of the others, it represents a slight break in what the technology can do and where we sit with it. That first wave around mechanization was about machinery that did more than our bodies could do. It was about machines that could move faster, push harder, lift more. It let us basically make human labor happen at scale. That second wave was about making it happen at scale and at speed, and where it wasn't just about the human body pushing that machinery, but that machinery now using electricity to drive faster and faster. That third wave took both of those pieces, the notion of being able to mechanize a process, in this case computation, and move it further forward. But each one of those in some ways relied on things we already knew how to do, and in some ways on augmenting our bodies. This last one isn't quite so simple, and it represents a very different break from the last one, and that's where I want to kind of leave the rest of my remarks here. First thing you need to know about that third wave of industrialization, so the thing the World Economic Forum says is about computers and digitization. So, first computers that we would recognize as such were built in the late 1940s, 1946 to be precise. ENIAC is experimented with and basically goes live in Philadelphia. It was huge. It probably took up the entire of this space here. When you turned it on, it required so much electricity that the power in Philadelphia flickered, and households all over Philly went, oh, there'll be computing again at the base. So computing was actually a thing you could see even if you weren't in the building. In Australia, we had our own version of this, a computer named originally Cicero and then CIRAC. It operated at the University of Melbourne, effectively in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. It also required an enormous amount of electricity, about 35 kilowatts for effectively 1 kilobit. So basically, it would take, I think, about 4 million of them to be your cell phone. And oh, by the way, it also took up this whole stage, so it wasn't terribly effective. But the things about these computers was that what they did was subtly different than what had happened up until then. So until 1946, when you said the word computer, what everyone imagined you meant was a human being who did maths. A computer was a person who did calculations. In fact, usually computers were women who did calculations, who sat in rooms and tabulated large bodies of numbers. But the consequence of World War II was that there was an inordinate amount of machinery that needed increasingly complicated calculations and an increasingly short amount of time. So the American Navy had a room full of women who did calculations to help aim basically guns off boats at things, and it became really clear that was inefficient. And so it's the US Navy that starts to experiment with building faster ways of doing calculations in order to brute force their way through numbers. So those first electronic computers were just smart calculators. But by the 1950s, those smart calculators become something else because they get programmed. So it's no longer a matter of basically punching the numbers in. You could now abstract the numbers onto punch cards and later onto tape and even later onto programs. And those programs told those computers what to do. You should recognize this. This is, in fact, command and control, and this is what we talk about when we talk about computing from 1946 to now, is that it operated inside a command and control architecture. Effectively, software told computers what to do. And they did it, and that's all they could do. That was it, right? And that is still true for most of the computing that will be allegedly turned off in your backpacks wherever you are sitting now, is that it mostly still operates this way. But starting about 10 years ago, computing started to feel and look and operate a little bit differently. Something called the Internet of Things turned up, and computing suddenly got smaller scale and everywhere and started to collect data in real time. And that was interesting. What was much more interesting was when that data collected in real time could drive those individual little pieces of technology to do work without an explicit program. So we moved from talking about command and control to talking about artificial intelligence, first by talking about algorithms and then new forms of learning. Now, I'm willing to bet most of you in the room have heard about these things and know a little bit about them. What's important to remember here is that we have spent an enormous amount of energy in the last 3 to 5 years talking about AI. It's not the first time. Artificial intelligence as a phrase was invented in 1956. It was really popular in 1956 and 1957 and 1958, and then not so popular for quite some time, because it turned out it was really hard. It required all this computing that people didn't have. Computers didn't do what they were supposed to. The guys who were working on it found that they got funded to do other things, and artificial intelligence kind of died a few times on the vine until we get to now, when it looks really pretty sexy and pretty interesting. But my contention and my argument would in some ways be that artificial intelligence is no more or no less than the steam engine to this next industrial revolution. It's not the end game. It's just the power. It's the thing that will make things possible, but like steam engines, it only gets interesting when you know what it's going to do. So, when Newcomb built the first steam engine, way back in the 1700s, he was very pleased with himself. It was a lot of work. There were a lot of people who had theorized steam engines, no one had made them successfully. He made one, it was kind of cool. And he showed a lot of his mates this steam engine, they went, that's really kind of nifty. And a lot of people went around going, oh, steam engine's kind of cool. This is a crass rendering of the 1700s, but, not inaccurate. And for a while, people went, yeah, what are you going to do with that? And eventually, he worked out that what you could do with that was pull water out of increasingly deep mines. So the first steam engine stood next to a mine. It was huge. It required an enormous amount of wood to make the steam that would create the power to pull the water out of the mines. It was a big piece of equipment. And for a long time, that's all steam engines did. They sat next to mines and pulled water out of holes. And then someone went, if you could do that, what else could you do? And imagining how to put that steam engine on a train meant thinking completely differently about a whole lot of things. You had to think differently about weight. You had to think differently about the relationship between the heat source and the water and the steam. You had to think about how you were going to carry the fuel, where you were going to find the water, because it came out of the mines. It wasn't going to come into the train in quite the same way. And the entire build of steam engines was transformed at the moment they had to be on a train. And then they were on boats. There is a glorious experiment in America where they tried to put them on an aeroplane. It went every bit as badly as you would expect. There was fire and things exploding, and no one ever tried it again, and that was probably for the best. Because what it made clear was that certain sorts of machinery require certain kinds of infrastructures. And when the steam engine went into the train, you suddenly didn't just have the men who made steam engines in the conversation, you had the guys who thought about actually building trains and laying train track and having to think about camber and grade and safety and selling tickets, and even as far as inventing, daylight savings time and standard time so that the trains would run on time, are all the consequences of moving the steam engine from sitting next to a mine to putting it into something that had to move. So if that's true about artificial intelligence, where would that leave us? If we imagine that what is happening here is we are going from a moment where computing was all command and control. We wrote software, the computer did its job. Artificial intelligence makes it possible, that bundle of technologies, for computing not to need a pre-written piece of software to do its job. It can now look at a body of data and determine what its job perhaps should be. It can decide based on previous activities what you might want to do next. These are forms of building algorithms, right? Whether they are prompted by humans or in this case, the data drives the decision making in the machine. You are now talking about the possibility of computational objects that aren't waiting for us to program them, or that aren't acting on a program that was written years ago for how to respond to a certain circumstance. So, what would computing look like if it doesn't sit inside a command and control architecture? What would be the principal questions and the things you would most need to manage and worry about? I think there are 3 critical questions that surface almost instantly, and they have implications for all of us no matter where we sit in this ecosystem, because they're all things we're going to need to contend with. The first one is, how are we going to manage these systems, right? What is that going to look like? What would be the ways you would manage it? You manage it through questions, right? The first question, first problem we have is, if these systems are no longer command and control, are they autonomous? And if so, what do we mean by that word? We've spent, the last 5 years, certainly the last 3, hearing an enormous amount about autonomous vehicles. Guess what? Every time you hear that word, underneath of it is a different instantiation of the architecture. How Google is making autonomous vehicles is completely different than how Volvo is. What Tesla is doing with their autonomous vehicle mode is completely different than what General Motors is doing. They all say autonomous loosely, but that's basically like saying that your BMW is exactly like your Commodore. And if any of you care about cars, you know that's not true. They are engineered differently, they are built to different standards, they have different implementations and different ideas about what a car should do. They have some things in common, wheels, doors, but the rest of it can feel radically different. The same is true with how those autonomous vehicles are functioning. Currently, Tesla, every one of those vehicles is networked in basically a hive mind. At the end of every cycle, those vehicles upload all the things they've encountered to a central repository, and that knowledge is, when it's considered relevant, pushed back out to everyone else in the system. They are a learning organism, basically. They are individual but not autonomous in the classic sense, right? They ladder up to something more. In other instantiations, we know that each one of those vehicles is separately architected and running on its own model where it isn't sharing data. We know some pieces that are being built in the autonomous vehicle space where those vehicles are actually communicating with each other in real time about the road situation around them, so that they are in fact an ad hoc network gathering data in real time. So one of the challenges here is when we talk about autonomy and autonomousness, we aren't actually clear about what we are saying. And the problem in English, at least, and not, I know, the native tongue for everyone in this room, but English, autonomy is this really slippery semantic term, because when I say autonomous, there's a whole set of things in your head that immediately pop. Something is autonomous, it has a self, it might be self-determining, it has consciousness, it has awareness. Somewhere in the deep, possibly not so deep if you're my age, recesses of your brain, I say autonomous and you think Cyberdyne Systems went live and killed us all. You possibly think the Terminator, you may think Frankenstein if you were literary. But we know that when things come to life and get conscious, nothing good comes of it. And autonomousness and consciousness get co-branded in our psyches in ways that aren't always helpful, right? Because it turns out you could be autonomous without necessarily having a fully developed human consciousness. But every time we go from talking about an autonomous vehicle to a self-driving vehicle, we've already made this interesting semantic move where the car suddenly got a self, basically, because the self-driving piece is not the human out of the loop. Complicated, right? But what does it mean to talk about autonomousness? How would we implement it? So if we want to talk just in the most basic terms about autonomous vehicles or autonomous systems, pick any robot, in order to build that, there are radical things you have to do to your environment. If we wanted to have a fleet of autonomous trucks, for instance, ploughing the road from Adelaide to Alice Springs, that seems like a good idea, right? That is a long stretch of road. We know it is dangerous. We know there are challenges. So for those of you not from Australia, that would be basically from the bottom of the middle to the halfway up. It's about 2,000 kilometres, give or take. Okay, so now we say autonomous trucks. Problem number one is, although the word autonomous suggests those trucks are contained, they actually need a network. So if you want to run autonomous vehicles on that road, you need to have a robust telecommunications network with low latency. Those of us who are Australians in the room already know the problem right there. So you'd need a robust telecommunications network with low latency. You could get some of it done with satellite, but satellite's not good for real-time communication of hazards or other kinds of things, and the latency, i.e. the amount of time it takes to bounce the signal backwards and forwards, is wrong. There's also a cable lying next to the Stewart Highway. You could crack that, pull it up, and, be fine, though there's some costing involved there. So problem number one is you need a robust telecommunications network. Without that, what you would find would be a fleet of autonomous trucks parked at the Pimba Roadhouse, which is a nice roadhouse, but it's probably not where you want to park your fleet. Your second problem is, in order for autonomous vehicles to work well, you need to have a clear and well-marked infrastructure for them to proceed on. They need to know the road is a road. If you grew up around anywhere in Australia, you know that there are parts of Australia where the road is a memory of a road at best, and frequently a dim memory. That's good. We know that, that thing over there that looks like it could be a road might be a road and we'll probably be fine on it. Trucks, not so much. They're not happy about that. So now we have two classes of problems. The vehicle can be autonomous, but you need to have an infrastructure, so there's actually a world beyond the autonomousness to make autonomousness possible. You need to have a network, you need to have a road structure. Oh, and by the way, you need to have an agreed to set of rules. And the challenge here is the vehicles can agree to the rules, but human beings are really terrible at this. My colleagues at Amazon, who have one of the largest fulfillment warehouses in the world, that has a shared floor space with humans and robotic objects that do shelving and pull things on and off the shelves. The robots have yellow lines in which they run around inside the factory. The humans are told explicitly to never cross the lines. The humans are not like all of you humans. They routinely cross the lines because they just don't think the lines apply to them, or they think they can get across them more quickly than the robot. This means we have an enormous amount of time with the robots and the humans not intersecting well. As far as anything we know about what happened yesterday in Arizona with the crash of the Uber vehicle and a pedestrian who was killed, one of the things that seems to be clear from the first wave of data that's available there is that the human acted in a way that was outside the rules. The vehicle was taught the rules. The human didn't obey the rules, and now we have an interesting conflict. So, when we think about what it means to make machinery autonomous, it's not just about the machinery and what autonomy might mean, it's about all the other pieces in the ecosystem that need to be functional too. It's about a network, it's about a clearly maintained and well-developed built environment, it's about a steady stream of data, it's also about a clear set of rules, and about who's participating in them and who isn't. And then there are all the interesting problems about how would you mark these objects as being autonomous such that everyone else who is encountering them knows how to behave accordingly. If you've seen a Tesla on the road and you've paid attention to it, you know it moves differently than other cars. It looks different. The way it proceeds, it has a very different flow on the roads. The early Priuses, when they turned up, confused the hell out of Australian wildlife because they could see the headlights and couldn't hear the car. And there was a lot of kangaroos, I'm sure, standing around going, I don't know what that is, bad. So how are we going to mark these objects as autonomous such that we know how to respond to them? You can't run around the entire world, much as I'm sure some of you in the room would like to, and paint yellow lines on everything and just go humans here, everything else over here. It's not going to work, right? So how are we going to manage that? And then last but by no means least, how will we think about regulation in this space? Who will regulate these objects? How will that regulation proceed? How will these objects be able to talk about what decisions they are making and what classes of decisions are being made, and how that will be unpacked? There was an experiment last year from DeepMinds in England, who are a machine learning and algorithm and AI company. They built a machine and they taught it to play Go, Chinese strategy game. It took about a month for that first machine to learn it, and it was exposed to the rules, to Go masters. It played game after game after game after game until it worked out basically the rule set and it started winning consistently. DeepMinds then did something really interesting. They effectively created an experiment where that first machine, taught by humans, taught a second machine to play Go without humans. It took that machine about 36 hours to work out the rules and to reliably beat human beings. So from a month to basically a day and a half. What was more interesting still was that second machine plays the game inside the rules, but with a set of strategies no one has ever seen before. And here's the complicated piece if you're a regulator, or frankly you are playing against it in both the metaphoric and literal senses. That second machine can't tell you why it is doing what it is doing. It doesn't know how to explain its actions. So it's autonomous, but it can't explain itself. How would you regulate that? How would you decide you wanted a piece of technology that behaved that way inside your ecosystem? Would you want something in a battle situation that made decisions that looked good but couldn't be explained? Would that sit inside the conventions by which many forms of encounters happen? We already know there are challenges in the financial markets of using tools that do this. What will it look like when it's everywhere else? So it might be autonomous, but how do we think about unboxing it, regulating it, managing it, What will all of that look like? So if those weren't disturbing enough problems, you have a second order set of problems. So first question is, if no longer command and control, is it autonomous? And if it is autonomous, what do we mean by that? And how will we build and manage that? The second set of questions are, okay, so now you've got these autonomous systems. How much agency do they have? I.e., how much can they act without checking back in? What is their control and limit mechanism? So if you are the autonomous vehicle example again, does your autonomous vehicle get to go to the edge of the ACT because it's federal and then should stop at the border? You know, think about every airport that we police, that would be one mechanism. You know, is it allowed to go to the edge of Victoria but not to South Australia because you wouldn't want to go to South Australia? Like, you know, what are the limits and how would you define those in advance? And oh, by the way, how would you make those visible? How would you think about multiple objects negotiating with each other who have different models of world inside of them? How do we think about what it will be to be human when certain classes of decisions are taken off of us and are now being enacted elsewhere? And also, by the way, how will you know what that looks like? So my colleagues at Google, who do some of the most interesting experiments in this space and who are incredibly good about being very transparent about what they're up to there, did some work last year, and they built a series of little tiny, basically intelligent agents, so little computational systems, and all they did was basically negotiate for cheap plane tickets. That was all their deal was get you a plane ticket. So we'll get you a plane ticket. Easy enough. Now, they built 3 of them. One they trained on chess for how you do strategic negotiations. One they trained again on Go for a different kind of strategic negotiation. And the third one they trained on a single-person shooter called Call of Duty. Now, I am willing to bet all of you in the room can work out which travel bot got the best price when you needed to get it done by lunchtime. Call of Duty, obviously. The problem was no one wanted to negotiate with that travel bot ever again because it was total scorched earth, right? It was really bad. So now scale that up. Imagine that you have intelligent agents, cyber-physical systems operating on your behalf, your institution's behalf, your branch of services behalf, and they're negotiating with someone else. How do you know what they were trained on? How do you know what they have decided the appropriate way to act is? How do you know what limits they have? If it's someone in your command, you know because you trained them or they were trained by people you knew inside a system that you understand, that is clear and transparent and reviewed. What will it look like when these systems have a capacity to act? How will they signal that? How will that be transparent? How will we regulate it? Will it be contextual or absolute? You can only go to Adelaide in the winter. You can only go when the temperature is above this direction. You can never go. And if it's conditional, where does that conditioning sit? Does it sit inside the object? Does it sit on the network? Does it sit in some third-party regulatory space? How does that work across national boundaries? Because again, these cyber-physical objects are going to move, but oh, by the way, like everything else that moves, they will be regulated. The same way there are pieces of technology and medical systems and people and in my childhood books that we didn't let into this country, it'll be true with these systems too. And oh, by the way, there'll be other parts of the world who aren't going to let these systems move into their regimes either. So how does all of that get played out and how does all of that get managed? So if not command and control and some degree of autonomy, what are the limits? Who sets them? How do they get reviewed? How do they get manifested and managed? Oh, and what's it going to feel like for all of us, just incidentally, because that would seem to be an important part of this puzzle too. And, oh, by the way, some of these systems are going to be talking to each other without us ever in the loop. So what's that going to be like? And how does that get made visible and managed and at what speed? And then last but by no means least, how on earth do you talk about the bundle of things that include safety, security, reliability, risk, trust, privacy, manageability, ease of use, explicability, a whole bundle of things. Now, I've spent 20 years, actually 25 years in Silicon Valley. One of the things that was always very clear to me in my time there that was we treated security as an afterthought. We built the system and then went, oh shit, we should work out how to secure it. Or sometimes we built the system and then waited 10 years and went, oh, we should have done something about that and bolted security on the end. The reality here with these systems is we're actually going to have to think about this from first principles all the way through. How do we imagine these systems will be secure? How will they be authenticated? How are we going to think about liability, trust, and risk? The first people that are putting stakes in the ground about this, their imaginations of this world are both interesting and different from one another and start to suggest this is going to be a contested landscape. The German government last American summer, North Hemisphere summer, last July, put out a set of standards that basically said, here is what is going to need to happen in order for autonomous vehicles to operate on German roads. And they had a tripartite version of what they thought should be risk. They said the car manufacturers will be responsible for the vehicle and liable for the vehicle's actions. However, the metric by which they would measure the safety improvement of the vehicles was not about diminishing danger to the drivers, but diminishing danger to pedestrians. Because their argument was these exist inside a society, and the implications of these vehicles can't be about diminishing road toll to drivers, it has to be about diminishing road toll to everyone outside of the vehicle. That's already an interesting logic leap, right? That's very different than we have seen perhaps in the United States. Second thing the Germans decided was that the local government, so the state government, was on the hook for building clear road-marked infrastructure. So no memories of roads in Germany, just roads, with clear signs, consistent signage, well-maintained. The third piece of the liability, they said, sat with the federal government, who were responsible for ensuring that there was an implementation of clear and well-abided to road rules for the whole country. Now think about, how is it that we are going to determine things like liability? You have a cyber-physical system, it was trained on one set of data, it is enacting a certain set of policies. Who's on the hook? Who's the scrutinizing body? Who decides if it's safe or not and under what circumstances? How do we then think in that AlphaGo example about how are you going to scrutinize something that doesn't even have a capacity to explain itself? Unsurprisingly, the EU has a series of regulations in this space, one of which is actually about the right to explanation. Will be a hard one to work through, right, of how will these systems explain themselves. And frankly, if you're a regulator, that is a thing you're going to be looking for. Can the system articulate what it is doing? How we think through this whole space is sometimes talked about as ethics. I actually think it is both more simple and more complicated than that. It is absolutely the case that we need to think about how do we build systems that do not reproduce manifest social inequities and do not create huge problems. Doing that requires thinking more crisply and cleanly about data, data provenance, and the biases in data. But this isn't just about being moral and ethical. This is actually about creating systems that can be scrutinized, where the decisions that are being built into the systems can be clearly made and clearly articulated. So, if not command and control, if instead systems that have some degree of autonomy, systems that will need a degree of agency, systems that will need assurance, we are talking about a profoundly different world than the one that we have inhabited for the last 60 years. We're also talking about a world where computer scientists and engineers, much as I love them, are not going to get it done. This isn't just a matter of bolting ethics onto CS and hoping that we can be happy. This is actually about saying, as was true with every previous wave of the Industrial Revolution, we had to build new ways of doing and being and thinking. We actually built new classes of human beings. The first wave of the Industrial Revolution gave us engineers. The second wave of the Industrial Revolution gave us business degrees and MBAs. The third wave gave us computer scientists. I don't know what this fourth wave will give us, but I know that's what I'm actively working on building here in Australia. So my current role here is to put all of those pieces back together again and say, if computing, if this fourth wave, this cyber-physical system world comes into existence, who is going to help us manage it? Who's going to help us build it? Who's going to help us regulate it? Who is going to make it work? This isn't about saying we need to get rid of computer science or engineering or business. This is about saying we need to build a new way of thinking. And so, for better or worse, that's what I'm doing at the ANU. I'm setting about working out how we would answer these questions, how they will in turn build a new academic discipline and a new body of knowledge. And I hope one day the people that I train will be working in your institution, which means I also need your help. So if any of this sounded interesting to any of you, bearing in mind there are a lot of you in the room, please track me down. I can't come to the speaker's corner because I've got to go rush back to campus. But if you suddenly thought, I want to help that woman build that applied science. I am not stupid enough to think I can do it on my own. So track me down, help me, and with that I'm going to say thank you.